Welcome back to Tales from the Jar Side, the video series. Don't feel like reading my newsletter? That's fine. I'll be happy to read it to you and give you additional backstory and other associated comments. My name is Ken Cousin. Let's get started. So the title this week is Tales from the Jar Side, New Videos, Reactive Spring and GitHub Copilot, Resolving Moral Dilemmas, and Tweets and Toots. And the subtitle is, Why did the chicken click on the PowerPoint presentation? To get to the other slide. Yeah, that's a really bad one. Sorry about that. Welcome, fellow jarheads, to Tales from the Jar Side, the Cousin IT newsletter for the week of... Oops. I forgot to update the week. Did you notice? Did anybody notice? At any rate, it says February 19th through 26th, when in fact that's the previous week. Last week was February 26th through March 5th, 2023. Oh well. This week I taught my Reactive Spring course as a No Fluff Just Stuff virtual workshop and my Making New Java Features Work For You course on the O'Reilly Learning Platform. That was my latest Java course. Regular readers of and listeners to, and of course video viewers of, this newsletter are affectionately known as Jarheads, and are far more intelligent, sophisticated, and attractive than the average newsletter reader or viewer or listener. If you wish to become a Jarhead, there's a button in the newsletter, as you can also go to the YouTube channel here at youtube.com/@talesfromthejarside, and there you'll be able to subscribe there and ring the bell and do whatever else you like. Okay. New videos this week. In addition to the regular newsletter video, I also made a video about the differences between the Mockito class and the class called, of all things, BDD Mockito. BDD for Behavior Driven Development. So this is a technical video about the Mockito testing framework. I'm reasonably happy with how it came out. It went pretty well. I'm not thrilled with my picture on the thumbnail there. I meant it to look like I was confused and I wound up looking like a walrus, but okay, so be it. I also left out any background music, so I didn't have to worry about that problem like I had the previous week. I showed the code I wanted to show, and I kept the video relatively short. For anyone interested in Mockito, I hope you like it. For your information, I later in the week turned that into an actual blog post for Medium that'll go in the Pragmatic Programmer's publication once it makes it through the queue. So that'll take a few weeks, but that'll come up eventually. Then, just because I got interested in it, I spent several hours putting together a 1-minute long YouTube short, which I described as by far the silliest video I've ever made. There's the tweet announcing that. South Pole and Saving Daylight, the silliest short I've ever made. I embedded it in the newsletter. You could see it here on the homepage for Tales from the Jar Side. The shorts are down here. Again, it's a minute long. Kind of a shame that with all this graphical stuff in here, the thumbnail is the code, which is probably the least visually impressive part of the whole thing. At any rate, you can see that. I've also got the music in there, good old Also sprach Zarathustra. I don't know. At any rate, the short met with moderate approval from my unofficial, official social media consultant. That's my son. He liked it, but he felt that the coding part should have been speeded up even more, and the crescendo of Also sprach Zarathustra should have matched the penguin looking up into space rather than the code, which the result being that the South Pole is currently on daylight savings time. Saving time, singular. Really hard to break that habit. Both are fair points. I don't know. The goal was the point that the South Pole's on daylight saving time, but so be it. It was quite the learning experience for me. I did find out how to speed up videos and using ScreenFlow. That took a little bit of learning. I also got to use my new library of clips. So since I use ScreenFlow so much, I finally purchased their stock media library. And that gives me, they say, like 500,000 clips and images and sound audio clips and everything. And that's where I found the animated penguin and the snow drifts and the space video. the sound I found online, but it was a copyright-free, or not copyright-free, what do you call it, royalty-free clip of the Schubert piece. So not Schubert, Richard Strauss piece. So okay, progress. I also learned how to resize the canvas to match the dimensions in a YouTube short, which took a lot more work than I expected. It was acting very flaky. So writing those down as bullet points make them sound easy, but it really did take hours. But it was an experiment. This is all a learning process for me for a while. So it didn't get as many views as the last one, but I'm reasonably happy with it. And I'm just going to keep adding videos to the Makito series as well. So my plan now, for those who are interested, is in addition to the regular newsletter recording like you're watching now, I also hope to do one technical video a week, whether it's in the Makito series or something on JUnit or AssertJ or functional Java or Groovy or Gradle. We'll see. And that short was just a bonus, mostly an excuse for me to experiment. Next section. Reactive Spring and the controversial part, GitHub Copilot. Now, I mentioned last week that I discovered when delivering my Reactive Spring course that the materials were out of date. One of the RESTful web services I normally accessed is no longer available, and that the database driver for MongoDB doesn't work in the current version of Spring Boot. Now, I don't know if that's just the regular driver or the Reactive Spring one, but either way, it was time to switch to this project, R2DBC, as in these are not the databases you're looking for. Wait a minute. Right. No, reactive relational database connectivity. So that meant a fair amount of work, replacing all of that, especially because I plan to add a RESTful web service controller in front of the database. And I wanted to support all the major HTTP verbs, get, post, put, and delete. So I discovered the problem last week, and I thought I had a couple months before I had to update it. And then when I was writing the newsletter last week, I went, oh, wait a minute. I'm teaching a similar course this week on Tuesday. So everything had to get updated pretty quickly. Now, I've been using GitHub Copilot for a while now. I've talked about it in the newsletter. That's your so-called AI paired programmer at github.com/features/Copilot, but I don't remember that. I just Googled GitHub Copilot and came directly here. I have paid for an annual subscription. I think that was $100, something like that. And like other major AI tools that are getting all the press these days, it's based on the OpenAI neural network models. This one was trained on programming projects stored on GitHub, as well as your own projects. When you use it in your IDE, you have to log in to GitHub, so it knows what you've done too. And I can only imagine it gives a higher preference to the code you've written before. The whole idea is rather controversial. There's a couple of articles I linked in here in case you're curious about them. First, open source copyright lawsuit challenges GitHub Copilot was on InfoQ, and GitHub launches Copilot for Business Plan as legal questions remain unresolved. That was in TechCrunch. And then the lawsuit that could rewrite the rules of AI copyright was in The Verge. You can take a look. Basically, what the lawsuits were about is that, first of all, did people putting code in a public repository really give GitHub permission to use their code to train a neural network when those things didn't even exist when they did all that? I mean, I don't know. But really where it came up is, if you look at the lawsuits, it's when someone writes some very specific detailed code to solve a particular problem that's somewhat unique. And then you can ask the neural network to solve that same problem, and it can arguably reproduce that one example that it learned from. Exactly, with no references or attribution or anything like that. And I could see how that would be problematic at best. But that's not my use case. I'm not doing any of that. When I'm teaching, I'm trying to show people so-called best practices, or more likely common practices. And that's exactly what a pattern matching AI tool is designed to do. And then I throw in this. I also realize this rationalization is potentially the first step down a dangerous path. I was in a hurry. And it really helped me enormously. It really did. I wound up generating both the controller code and the test that worked remarkably well, although you have to know what you're looking for and you have to look for problems. The problem with a pattern matching tool like this is that the code is always plausible. That doesn't mean it's right. To give you an example, here is, in fact, my customer controller, which is a REST controller. And I have methods here for get requests and post requests and delete requests, and I don't have one for a put request. So here, immediately GitHub Copilot says, oh, you want a put mapping too? And I'll go, sure. And it says, oh, well, how about this method? And if I hit tab, it'll accept all that code. And it's right, but it's not right for me. I mean, this is the right idea. Go look up the ID, and if it's there, update the existing customer with the first name and last name that comes from the argument, and then save it. Otherwise, and then map it to an OK, so you get a 200 accept. And then if the find by ID was an empty mono, then put in a not found response. The reason it's not right for me is that I'm using records for my customer, and you can't update a record. Records are immutable in Java. So in other words, this code, the method names are already wrong because records use first name and last name instead of get or set, and they're immutable. There is no set. So this isn't quite right. You know, I have to undo all this and go, no, that's not really what I intended. So you still have to know what you're doing and play with it. But I made a lot of progress, a lot faster than I think I otherwise would have, because it knew the API really, really well. So, and of course I wrote test cases, to be sure everything's working. So if you want to see my code, I concluded, by the way, by saying I think GitHub Copilot earned its annual subscription fee just last week for me. If you want to see my code, I added this GitHub repository and got it wrong. If you actually go there, I tried to go to the sub-project Reactive Customers, and that's the mistake. I should go to the parent, just regular github.com/cousin/reactive-spring, and then you could see the Reactive Customers project underneath it, which has that tree master stuff in it. In other words, I could have put in the right link and I didn't. So at any rate, now you know. Next section. A rationalization framework. Now, that was one moral dilemma I was dealing with this week, was whether to use a tool like GitHub Copilot or not. A couple others came up. Speaking of moral dilemmas, I've been struggling with a couple of them recently. One is not really a dilemma. I mean, I believe I know what's right and what's wrong here. I just don't know what to do about it. And that has been the increasingly terrible, hostile treatment of trans people lately by the extreme right. And my only dilemma there is what else I can do to help to make their lives easier, to fight this encroachment of trying to banish their existence from public life entirely, or life in general, if you really listen to where they're headed. I decided one way I could at least say something about this issue, because normally I wouldn't even bring up an issue like that in the newsletter, but I have to do something, and I do support 3 trans creators on Patreon. Now, I'm happy to support a variety of creators on Patreon. I tend to support a whole bunch of creators at a low level rather than a handful at a high level. But it's true that 3 of them are, in fact, trans women. And I thought I'd mention them to you. One is known as ContraPoints, or that's the name of her feed. Her name is Natalie Wynn. She describes herself as a PhD dropout who makes YouTube videos mostly discussing internet culture, politics, and LGBT, presumably now Q+ issues. I've learned a ton from her. Just watching her discuss these issues makes them much clearer and more understandable, and she's quite insightful. Her videos tend to be very long, and she doesn't post very many of them lately. So I'm looking forward to when she resumes effort. She's got one coming, I know, relatively soon. Jessie Gender is a Star Trek person, very much used to, in fact, that's how I encountered her, is she has a lot of videos on critical discussions about issues in Star Trek. And as she says, she discusses a wide range of issues. She was notably called out recently by the problematic, I should say, author of the Harry Potter books. I'm referring to her now as She Who Shall Not Be Named. Jesse's very insightful. The biggest problem I have with Jessie is her essays have been getting longer and longer, so I have to clear out a fair amount of time in order to watch them. But there's a lot of good stuff in there. I'm glad she's putting her content on Nebula. If you're not familiar with Nebula, Nebula is a creator-owned service that doesn't suffer from the whims of the YouTube algorithm and everything. And they're really, really good. You get a lot of excellent content here. And I'd probably spend more time here than I do on any other site these days. And it cost me $20 a year. Now, I got it as part of a bargain with Curiosity Stream. But that price it's unbeatable. It's not $20 a month. It's $20 a year for the whole thing. Wonderful. The third creator is Abigail Thorne, who runs a site called PhilosophyTube. And she is an actress or an actor, however you want to say it. The actor, I believe, is a generic term, and a philosopher. And the funny part is I used to watch her before she transitioned. I didn't know that was coming. I just thought her videos were really good and fascinating. And then she did a very public transition, made a video that got, I think it was well over 1 million views, did extremely well. And she's arguably the most well-known trans person in the UK based on her YouTube feed. She wrote her own play called The Prince, and it ran for a week live in London and to sold out houses, did really well. She then put the recording of that play on Nebula because they partly funded the whole process. And my wife and I watched it. We really enjoyed it. It was really well done. So those are the Patreon the people I support through Patreon who I know are trans. There's also the possibility that there's additional ones I'm supporting that I don't know are trans. It's already happened to me before, and that's fine. You know, they handle that however you want. In fact, the thing that I have realized is that while it took me a little while to get used to them, it's especially the first one when I started watching. I mean, I grew up in this culture too, and I'm an old white guy. I mean, you know, I absorbed a lot of the misgivings in the culture. And it took me a little bit of time to get used to it. But I got over it, and I got to know them. Or at least I feel like I got to know them. I got to know the public persona that they share on the internet. And now I don't really think of them as trans. I just think of them as Jessie and Abigail and Natalie. And that's enough. And that works for me. I just wish some of those horrible people at the CPAC conference or people like Ron DeSantis would do the same, but that would conflict with their boundless ambition and money-making pursuits, and therefore it's probably not going to happen. I do wish I could do more to help, and I'll be keeping an eye out if an opportunities come along, but that's about all I can do so far. Now, the other dilemma that I wrestled with this week actually came up a while ago, but I was reminded about it this week. It had to do when I was going to record some music over a karaoke track that was made famous by one particular singer that I remembered from my childhood. And then I went and looked up that singer on Wikipedia and kind of wished I hadn't. I mean, the way I expressed it is, it looks like Grandpa spent too much time watching Fox News, and I'll just leave it at that. So I had to decide, was I still going to use that music or not? And what triggered all this was another video on Nebula, but also on YouTube by Maggie Mae Fish, talking about the Tar movie that has been nominated for an Academy Award. Tar is about a conductor, I should say, an orchestra conductor named Lydia Tarr and her descent into problems from an enormously high region. It's a tragedy. And at one point in the movie, Tar is talking to a student, and the student is having difficulty conducting a piece because he knows something about the composer, and the composer was quite problematic, and he had problems with that. And of course, she didn't want to hear any of that, and she trashed him publicly and everything. The more I hear about that movie, the less I actually want to see it. At any rate, it relates to that big issue of death of the author. And that's kind of what I was faced with. You know, how much can you separate the art from the artist? And should you even do that? Now, I don't have an answer to that. I'm not sure there is an answer to that. But I have an approach, and I thought I'd let you know what I did. in these cases. So in the case of the karaoke track, yeah, I went ahead and used it. And my rationalization, my arguments were basically that the original singer didn't write it. He's not gaining anything from the publishing rights. He just made it popular, and he's long gone, and I don't know that he or his estate are connected to it in any way anymore. Besides, most people who aren't in my generation aren't even going to recognize the name anymore anyway. So I figured avoiding the song only hurt me, and I don't want to give that person that kind of power over my life. Now, I think that's a reasonable set of arguments. It bothers me a little bit how self-serving they are. I mean, I got to do what I wanted to do, but I think it's justifiable. Now, in the case of the trans issues, in addition to my Patreon support and mentioning them in the newsletter, I also have no plans to buy anything by that problematic author of the Harry Potter series again, especially the recent video game release. But again, this is not exactly a high hurdle for me. I'm not much of a video gamer. I don't own a gaming system. I probably wouldn't have bought it anyway, But it's the least I can do is to avoid it, so I can avoid it. I have to admit, though, I used to reread those Harry Potter books every once in a while. I just really enjoyed them. And now I can't. And it's not just because I don't feel like it's being an ally. I mean, it's a sunk cost. The books are already bought. What difference does it make? But it's more that now that I know something about the woman behind them, it changes how I read some of the scenes and how I read some of the characters. And it's just not as fun anymore. It really took a lot of the spirit out of it. Oh well. I'm very troubled by the creeping fascism growing quickly in the U.S. Now, the last couple of elections show that all hope is not lost, but it's very worrying that there's so many angry white males who will do anything to justify their own white supremacy and feel threatened somehow, and victims and all this is ridiculous, And I worry about it. Now, I live in Connecticut, so it's probably going to hit me last, but still, you never know with these things. So I am trying to help. One, because it's the right thing to do. It obviously is. And other, because, well, I still have a self-serving motive. Sooner or later, they're going to come for me. I just know it. Okay, that was happy. Let's move on to another topic. Let's discuss the tweets and toots this week. So the first one says, that didn't go where I expected. So the dad joke says, a colon can completely change the meaning of a sentence. For example, Jane ate her friend's sandwich. Or Jane ate her friend's colon. Okay. Yeah, that gets a rim shot. I mean, that's after those grammatical jokes that always involve commas, and especially the Oxford comma, the panda that eats, shoots, and leaves and all that. There's lots of examples of that. This is the first one I've seen with a colon. That's a pretty good gag. The other gag from the same site said, I told my wife that a husband is like a fine wine. We just get better with age. The next day she locked me in the cellar. Yep, very good. A cask of Amontillado and all that. I guess I'm not the only person whose humor seems to have a darker edge recently. Good choice. This cartoon came up on a post, and I just grabbed the cartoon. It says, pull the sword from the stone and become the new king. And here comes the person who's going to pull the sword, says, are there any other jobs available? And the wizard says, get the cat out of the tree and become the new librarian. And of course, in the last panel, there's the guy sitting there reading a book in the library with the cat asleep on the desk. Perfect. Very good. I could see that. The next one was a post I saw on Mastodon. I titled the section, Eric Killmonger has issues, too. And the post says, oh, Alex Murdaugh is guilty? Shocking. Next, you'll be telling me that James Kill People also did it. Alex Murdaugh, huh? Murder. Yeah, it never occurred to me until I saw that. I thought that's pretty good. And then this one, the Dr. Pepper joke. Actually, Dr. Pepper is the guy who created it. What you're drinking is really Pepper's Monster. But then, of course, if you drink it, are you then the monster? It's, scary thought. Speaking of AI, with those issues, there was a nice post on Mastodon that said, don't anthropomorphize computers. They hate that. Which, yeah, I'll bet they do. Sure. Really hard to avoid doing that, isn't it? And then finally, I found this image for my wife and her crafting friends. It's a needlepoint that says, "Warning, this is proof I have the patience to stab something 1,000 times." Yeah, okay. Have a great week, everybody. So as a reminder, you can see all my upcoming public training courses on the O'Reilly Learning Platform at this link, and my No Fluff Just Stuff virtual workshops at this link. This week I have 2 No Fluff virtual workshops, one on JUnit Jupyter and Assert J, and the other on mocks, stubs, and spies with Mockito 4, the subject of my new book. Wait a minute. Prog. Mockito Made Clear. That subject may come up. You never know. In the meantime, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate your listening, and I'll see you next week.